Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The far eastern colony of the Victoria Empire had long been a place of rigid imperial control, but now, for the first time in its history, the winds of change were sweeping through its cobbled streets and towering spires. The people, once accustomed to taking orders from far-off rulers, were about to taste a new kind of power, the power to choose their own leaders. The colony was on the brink of its first democratic election, an event that had stirred hope among many, but also fear among those who thrived in the shadows of control. At the heart of this turmoil stood Karl, commander of the local Night Order, a man whose very soul was forged in the fires of duty and loyalty. His armored frame towered over the busy streets as he rode his steed through the marketplace, watching the crowds prepare for the coming election. Banners of various factions fluttered in the wind, vendors hawked their goods, and children ran through the alleys with carefree abandon, unaware of the tension that hung like a heavy mist over their parents. Karl was a man of few words, but his presence was commanding. Beneath his polished helmet, his eyes scanned the faces of the people. He saw excitement, but he also saw fear of the unknown, fear of the unrest that had begun to bubble beneath the surface. Whispers of a cult, the children of the abyss, had reached his ears days ago. A dark force was gathering strength, threatening to disrupt the election and plunge the colony into chaos. Karl pulled the reins of his horse and halted in front of the old tavern, a place he knew well. Here, he would meet with a woman named Alina, a local who had come to him with warnings of the cult's activities. He wasn't sure what to make of her yet. A part of him, trained to distrust anything not sanctioned by the Empire, saw her magic as a threat. But another part of him, the part that cared for the people, the part that wanted to see this election succeed, couldn't afford to ignore her. He entered the tavern, ducking under the low-hanging beams. The air inside was thick with the smell of spiced wine and roasting meat, but it was the woman seated in the corner that caught his attention. Alina was striking, not in the way of imperial nobility, but in the way of someone whose strength ran deeper than appearances. Her dark hair fell in waves over her shoulders, and her eyes, sharp and knowing, met his with a hint of expectation. "You came," she said, her voice low and calm. "I said I would." Karl sat across from her, his armor creaking slightly as he did. "What do you know about the children of the abyss?" "They're not just rumors, if that's what you're thinking." Alina leaned forward, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. "They've been performing rituals in the catacombs, summoning things that should remain buried." Karl frowned. He'd heard stories of the cult before, but to think they could summon actual demons? It seemed like madness. Still, there were too many strange occurrences as of late, too many unexplained deaths and disappearances for him to dismiss her claims outright. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. Alina smiled, but it was a sad smile, one touched by history and loss. "Because this land used to belong to my people. Long before the Empire came. The magic that runs through my veins is tied to this place, to its ancient power. If the cult succeeds, they won't just stop the election, they'll destroy everything, including the magic that still lingers here. I won't let that happen." Karl studied her face, searching for any hint of deception. He found none. Whatever her motives, she spoke with a conviction that echoed his own. He had sworn an oath to protect the colony, to maintain order. If that meant working with someone outside the imperial structure, then so be it. "I'll need more than your word," Karl said. "I need proof." "You'll get it." Alina stood, her movements graceful yet purposeful. "Come with me." They left the tavern and rode out of the city, past the tall, narrow houses and busy markets, out to the forest where the air was cool and the trees ancient. The farther they went, the quieter the world became, until the only sounds were the crunch of leaves under their boots and the distant call of birds. Alina led him to a clearing deep within the woods. Here, the ground was different, softer, almost alive with a pulse that Karl couldn't quite understand. Alina knelt and placed her hand on the earth. Moments later, a faint glow surrounded her, and the air seemed to hum with energy. Carl felt it too, though it was foreign to him, something beyond the reach of his disciplined mind. "This is the magic of my ancestors," Alina said quietly. "It's tied to the land itself. The cult is trying to corrupt it, to twist it into something dark and destructive. But I can feel it still. There's hope, if we act quickly." Carl was silent for a long moment, watching the way the light danced around her fingers. He had never trusted magic, had always seen it as something unpredictable, something dangerous. But here, in this sacred place, he could not deny its power. And if what Alina said was true, then the election, the very future of the colony, depended on their success. "We'll stop them," Carl said finally, his voice firm with resolve. "Whatever it takes." Alina nodded, standing to face him. "Then we have no time to waste." Election day dawned with a bright sky, but the air was thick with tension. In the heart of the colony, crowds had already begun to gather outside the polling stations, some eager to cast their vote, others there to cause trouble. Carl stood at the front of his knights, watching the people with a wary eye. He had doubled the patrols, placing guards at every entrance, but he knew it wouldn't be enough if the cult struck. As the sun climbed higher, so did the unrest. Factions began to argue, their voices rising into shouts. Protesters, stirred by the cult's propaganda, marched through the streets, waving banners that denounced the election as a farce. Carl's men moved to break up the fights before they could escalate, but the tension was palpable, like a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Alina was somewhere in the city, her magic attuned to the dark forces that Carl couldn't see. He trusted her to alert him if anything went wrong, but even with her by his side, he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. His fears were realized when a young squire ran up to him, his face pale with fear. "Commander, the catacombs, Thavia." Before the boy could finish, a deafening roar shook the ground. Carl's heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the source of the sound. In the distance, near the old cathedral, dark smoke began to rise, curling into the sky like the tendrils of some monstrous beast. He didn't need to hear the rest of the squire's report to know what had happened. "They've summoned them," Carl muttered under his breath. He turned to his men, his voice sharp and commanding. "To the cathedral." Now, the knights mounted their horses and charged through the streets, the clatter of hoofs echoing off the stone walls. As they neared the cathedral, the sky darkened, and the air grew thick with a stench of sulfur. Demons, vile creatures with twisted forms and glowing eyes, had begun to spill out from the catacombs, attacking anyone in their path. Carl's sword was out in an instant, cutting through the first demon that lunged at him. His knights followed suit, their blades flashing in the dim light as they fought to protect the people. But for every demon they struck down, more seemed to appear, as if the catacombs were an endless well of darkness. Amidst the chaos, Carl spotted Alina, standing at the entrance to the catacombs, her hands glowing with magical energy. She was chanting something in a language he didn't understand, and as she did, the demons recoiled, their shrieks filling the air. "Carl!" she called out, her voice strained. "We need to close the portal, or they'll keep coming." Carl nodded, his muscles burning with exertion as he fought his way toward her. The demons were relentless, but so was he. With every step, he cut down another monster, determined to reach Alina before it was too late. When he finally reached her, she was pale, her magic taking a toll on her body. "I can hold them off for a little while longer," she said through gritted teeth. "But you need to get down there and stop the cult. They're the ones keeping the portal open." Carl hesitated for only a moment before plunging into the dark mouth of the catacombs. Carl descended into the catacombs, his boots echoing off the stone walls as he plunged deeper into the darkness. The air was cold, oppressive, and thick with a scent of sulfur. His grip tightened on his sword as he navigated the narrow passages, his heart pounding in his chest. Alina's words echoed in his mind. He had to stop the cult and close the portal before it unleashed enough demons to destroy the colony entirely. The sounds of battle above grew fainter as he moved farther underground, replaced by an eerie silence that sent a chill down his spine. The walls were etched with symbols he didn't recognize, a dark, twisted marks that pulsed with malevolent energy. He knew he was getting close. Ahead, the passage opened into a vast chamber, illuminated only by the flickering glow of torches and the sickly light of the portal. The portal itself was a swirling vortex of darkness, hovering in the center of the room, tendrils of energy stretching out like the arms of some ancient beast. Around it, cloaked figures chanted in low, guttural voices, their words feeding the dark magic that kept the portal open. At the center of the cult stood Harrow, the fanatical leader of the Children of the Abyss. His eyes were wild with madness, his hands raised toward the portal as if he were commanding it with his very will. Behind him, more demons began to emerge, clawing their way through the vortex and into the world. Carl's blood boiled as he took in the scene. This was the man responsible for the chaos above, the one who sought to tear apart everything Carl had sworn to protect. Without a second thought, Carl surged forward, his sword flashing in the dim light as he cut through the nearest cultist. The man crumpled to the ground, but the others barely flinched, their chanting growing louder in response. Harrow's gaze snapped toward Carl, a sneer twisting his features. "You're too late, Knight. The abyss has already opened its maw, and soon, it will swallow this colony whole." Carl didn't waste time responding. He lunged at Harrow, his sword aimed for the cult leader's heart, but Harrow was faster than he'd expected. With a wave of his hand, a burst of dark energy shot from his fingertips, slamming into Carl and sending him crashing into the wall. Pain shot through Carl's body as he struggled to regain his footing, his vision blurring for a moment before sharpening again. Harrow laughed, the sound echoing through the chamber. "You cannot stop what is already in motion." Carl pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his ribs. "We'll see about that." He charged again, but this time, he was ready for Harrow's magic. As another wave of dark energy flew toward him, Carl ducked and rolled to the side, coming up behind one of the cultists. With a swift motion, he severed the man's head from his shoulders, his body collapsing in a heap. The chanting faltered for a moment, but then resumed, as if the loss of one meant nothing to them. But Carl could sense it now. There was a weakness in their formation, a delicate balance that kept the portal open. If he could disrupt the ritual, break their concentration, the portal might collapse in on itself. He fought with renewed purpose, cutting through the cultists with precision and speed, his sword slicing through flesh and bone as he moved closer to Harrow. Each time he killed one, the energy around the portal seemed to flicker, as if it were losing its grip on the world. Harrow, realizing what Carl was doing, roared in fury. "No! You will not take this from me!" He raised his hands again, summoning a massive demon from the portal. The creature was a towering beast, its skin charred and black, its eyes glowing like hot coals. It lunged at Carl, its claws extended, but Carl met it head on, his sword clashing against its massive form. The battle was fierce, each strike sending shock waves through Carl's body as he fought to hold his ground. The demon was strong, but Carl's training, his years of discipline and strategy, gave him the edge. He ducked beneath its claws, slashing at its legs, and with a final, powerful strike, he drove his sword into the creature's chest. The demon let out a deafening roar before disintegrating into ash. Harrow's face twisted with rage, his control over the portal weakening. "You will pay for this, Knight." Carl turned to face him, bloodied but unbroken. "It's over, Harrow." With a final, desperate cry, Harrow unleashed a torrent of dark energy, but this time, Carl was ready. He raised his sword, the blade glowing with a faint light as it absorbed the magic. Harrow's eyes widened in shock as the energy was redirected back at him, slamming into his chest and sending him crashing to the ground. The portal flickered violently, its stability shattered by the disruption of the ritual. Carl could feel the ground trembling beneath his feet, the walls of the catacombs groaning as if they were about to collapse. He didn't wait for the portal to implode. He turned and sprinted for the exit, his lungs burning as he raced up the stairs and back into the city. The sounds of battle greeted him as he emerged, but the sky was lighter now, the demonic horde beginning to retreat as the portal lost its power. Alina stood at the entrance to the cathedral, her face pale but determined. She saw Carl and ran to meet him, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of defeat. "It's done," Carl said, his voice hoarse. "The portal's closing." Alina let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Then we still have a chance." Together, they made their way back to the central square, where the people had gathered once more. Despite the chaos, despite the destruction, the election was still happening. The polling stations were damaged but not destroyed, and the knights were doing their best to maintain order. Carl and Alina watched as the people cast their votes, a symbol of hope amidst the ruins. It wasn't just an election anymore, it was a statement, a declaration that they would not be ruled by fear or darkness. The colony's future was being written in that moment, one vote at a time. As the last of the demons were driven from the city, Carl stood in the square, his armor battered, his body exhausted, but his spirit unbroken. He had fought for the people, for their right to choose, and in doing so, he had found something worth more than any imperial decree. Alina approached him, her steps slow, her expression unreadable. "You did it," she said quietly. "We did it," Carl corrected her, his eyes meeting hers. "Without you, this city would have fallen." Alina smiled, a genuine smile this time, free of the sadness that had weighed on her before. "I didn't do it for the Empire. I did it for the people, for their future." Carl nodded. He understood now. The election wasn't just about politics, it was about giving the people a voice, a chance to shape their own destiny. And in that, Alina's magic and his sword had found common ground. As the sun set over the colony, casting a golden light over the rubble-strewn streets, the results of the election were announced. The people had chosen their leaders, and with that choice came a new beginning. Carl watched as the crowds cheered, as hope began to replace fear in their eyes. The battle was over, but the fight for the colony's future had only just begun. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more enemies lurking in the shadows, but for now, there was peace. And that was enough. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Carl turned to Alina. "What will you do now?" Alina looked out over the city, her eyes distant. "There's still much work to be done. My people need me, but I'll be here when the time comes." Carl nodded, understanding the weight of her words. They had fought side by side, but their paths were different. Still, their bond, forged in battle and strengthened by trust, would remain. With one last glance at the city they had saved, Carl sheathed his sword and walked into the night, ready to face whatever came next.